So let's start with a bit of a riddle. What on earth could possibly connect a famous poet like T.S. Eliot, a legendary rock band like The Doors, and an iconic war movie like Apocalypse Now? I know it sounds like the beginning of a really weird joke, right? But the answer is actually a single, incredibly powerful, and, oh yeah, deeply controversial book that completely changed how the 20th century thought about itself.
And this is it, The Golden Bough by Sir James George Frazer. Now, when this first came out in 1890, it wasn't just another book. It was this gigantic, epic attempt to create one single theory for all of human belief, tracing our journey from ancient magic all the way to modern science. Its influence was just massive, but probably not in the way its author ever thought it would be.
So, you might be wondering, how does a stuffy-looking, scholarly book of anthropology become so explosive? Well, it's because Frazer wasn't messing around. He took on the biggest subjects you can imagine. We're talking magic, sacrifice, gods, kings, the whole shebang. And he was not afraid of where his research led him, even when it pointed right at the very foundations of Western culture.
At its heart, what the book was really doing was this massive act of comparison. Frazer was like a detective collecting stories and rituals from every corner of the globe, from ancient Babylon to tribes that were still around in his day. And he was looking for the universal patterns, kind of like the hidden DNA that connects all of our beliefs.
And this is what caused the firestorm. See, Frazer didn't just stick to what people back then would have called primitive or pagan myths. Nope. He put the story of Jesus, the crucifixion, the resurrection, right next to all these other stories of dying and reviving gods from ancient cults. And for Victorian Britain, that was absolutely shocking. It basically suggested that their most sacred belief wasn't unique, but was maybe just another version of a much, much older myth.
But here's the crazy thing. This enormous, world-spanning theory didn't just come out of nowhere. It all started in one specific, really mysterious place, with a single dark riddle from ancient Italy that Frazer just had to solve.
And our story starts right here, in this incredible painting by J.M.W. Turner. This is Lake Nemi, just south of Rome. The ancient Romans called it Diana's Mirror. It was a place with this immense sacred energy, and at its heart was a special grove of trees, guarded by a very unusual kind of priest. He was called the Rex Nemorensis, which means the king of the wood. But let me tell you, this was not a job you'd want. His kingship was one of constant fear, because he knew that at any moment, the man who was destined to replace him could show up to challenge and kill him.
So just listen to how this bizarre ritual worked. First, a challenger, who had to be a runaway slave, would show up at the grove. He had to find a particular sacred tree and break off a branch. That branch was the famous Golden Bough. Only then was he allowed to fight the current king to the death. And if he won, he became the new king, living with that same title and that same fear, just waiting for the next runaway slave to come for him. Frazer was just obsessed with this question. Why? What could this endless cycle of ritual murder possibly mean?
So for Frazer, this one dark ritual became the master key. He was convinced that if he could just unlock its meaning, he could unlock the meaning behind every myth and every religion all over the world.
And here's his big aha moment. The idea of the dying and reviving God. He came up with this theory that the king of the wood wasn't just some guy. He was the human incarnation of a god of nature. And his murder wasn't just a murder, it was a sacrifice. It was necessary to make sure his divine power was passed on, still young and strong, to a new king. And that would guarantee that the seasons would keep turning and the crops would grow. Frazer started seeing this exact same pattern everywhere he looked.
And that idea led him to an even bigger theory, which is his three-stage evolution of human thought. He argued that first, humanity went through an age of magic, where we tried to directly force nature to do what we wanted. When we realized that didn't work, we moved into the age of religion, where we started asking gods to step in and help us out. And finally, we arrived at the age of science, where we use reason and observation to understand and control the world ourselves. For Frazer, this was progress, the ultimate story of humanity.
And just to give you a sense of how ambitious this project really was, the final edition of The Golden Bough wasn't just one book. Oh no, it swelled to 12. 12 massive volumes.
And just look at some of the titles of these volumes. They read less like science and more like poetry, right? The Dying God, The Scapegoat, Balder the Beautiful. It's this incredibly literary, almost mythic style that really helps you understand why this book had such an incredible hold on people's imaginations.
But here's the twist. While all the poets and artists were falling head over heels for The Golden Bough,
The academic world, the very field Frazer basically helped create, was turning on him. And they turned on him hard.
The change in opinion was just dramatic. What was first celebrated as this new science of humanity was later called an embarrassment to anthropology. The main problem was his method. He would connect myths from totally different cultures, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, just because they seemed similar to him. It wasn't based on hard evidence of any real connection. His huge, beautiful theories were mostly built on pure speculation.
But you can't forget how huge its initial impact was. Bronislaw Milanovsky, who's one of the fathers of modern anthropology, said he was literally enslaved by the book. It inspired a whole generation of scholars to actually go out into the field and study other cultures.
But eventually, that same generation grew up and rejected him. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein probably gave one of the most savage critiques. He basically said that Frazer's neat and tidy Victorian explanations were actually way more simplistic and crude than the deep, complex rituals he was trying to explain away. Ouch.
Okay, so if The Golden Bough was a failure as a work of science, why in the world are we still talking about it today? Well, it's because its real legacy wasn't in a university department. It was in art, in literature, and in film.
Seriously, the list of people influenced by this book is just a who's who of 20th century genius. T.S. Eliot flat out credited Frazer in the notes for his poem The Wasteland. You can feel the book's DNA in James Joyce, in W.B. Yeats, even in horror writers like H.P. Lovecraft. And huge thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Joseph Campbell, they built their own famous theories right on top of the foundations that Frazer had laid.
And that brings us right back around to where we started. The title of that Doors song, Not to Touch the Earth, that's lifted straight from a chapter title in The Golden Bough. And in Apocalypse Now, Colonel Kurtz is literally reading the book on screen, and his death at the end is staged as a modern version of that same ritual, the new king murdering the old king to take his place.
And that right there is the central paradox, isn't it? The Golden Bough might have been bad science, but it was an absolutely brilliant story. You could almost say Frazer wasn't just writing about myths. He was creating a brand new, modern myth of his own. A huge, epic story about humanity's long journey from superstition into the light of reason. And it was that story that artists found completely irresistible.
Even decades later, you have cultural critics like Camille Paglia who still defend the book. She basically argues that, look, even if the facts are out of date, its incredible imaginative power is still a vital source of inspiration. And it leaves us with a really fascinating question, right? Can a book be factually wrong, but somehow still be artistically or even spiritually true? Can a work that science has totally dismissed still hold some deeper, more important kind of wisdom?